The cargo freighter shook violently as it tore through the atmosphere. Taemin grabbed onto the metal railing in the engine room, his knuckles white from the pressure. Alarms screamed throughout the ship. Red warning lights flashed against the dark walls. Something had gone terribly wrong with the main engines, and now the ship was falling from the sky like a broken bird. The impact came suddenly. Metal screamed against rock and earth. Taemin felt himself thrown across the room. His head struck something hard, and darkness swallowed him whole. When he woke up, everything hurt. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Small fires burned in different places around the twisted wreckage. Taemin pushed himself up slowly, checking his body for serious injuries. His left arm throbbed with pain, and blood dripped from a cut on his forehead. But he could move. He was alive. The engine room had been torn apart by the crash. Pieces of machinery lay scattered everywhere. Taemin climbed over the debris, searching for a way out. The emergency exit had been crushed, but there was a gap in the broken hull large enough for him to squeeze through. Outside, the planet looked like something from a nightmare. Thick jungle surrounded the crash site. Strange purple vines hung from massive trees with black bark. The air felt heavy and wet against his skin. In the distance, something howled. A sound that made his stomach twist with fear. Taemin looked back at the wreckage. The ship had broken into 3 main pieces scattered across a clearing. Smoke rose from each section. He needed to search for other survivors, but the thought of what he might find made him hesitate. Then he heard it. A sound that cut through the crackling of fires and the alien jungle noises. A high-pitched cry, desperate and afraid. He moved toward the sound, climbing over broken metal and scattered cargo containers. The crying grew louder. It came from beneath a collapsed section of the passenger deck. Taemin's heart raced as he got closer. Someone was trapped down there. When he finally saw what was making the noise, he stopped breathing for a moment. It was not human. The creature was small, about the size of a 6-year-old child. Its body was covered in scales that shimmered with different colors, shifting from blue to green to purple in the light. It had 4 legs and a long tail that thrashed wildly. Multiple eyes, at least 6 of them, were positioned around its head. Sharp claws dug into the ground as it tried to pull itself free from the metal beam that had crushed its back leg. Taemin recognized the species immediately. Velkorian. Even people who had never left Earth knew about Velkorians. They were one of the most dangerous predator species in the galaxy. Adult Velkorians stood 3 meters tall and could tear apart armored vehicles with their bare claws. They were warriors, hunters, and they had never been friendly to humans. This was a cub. But even young Velkorians were deadly. Its claws could easily cut through his flesh. Its teeth, visible as it hissed in pain and fear, were already sharp enough to break bone. Every instinct Taemin had told him to run, to get as far away from this creature as possible before it broke free or before its parents showed up. But the cub was dying. He could see that clearly. The metal beam had crushed its leg badly. Dark blood, almost purple in color, pooled beneath it. The cub's breathing came in rapid, shallow gasps. Its scales had lost some of their shimmer, turning dull gray in places. It was terrified and in terrible pain. Taemin stood there, frozen with indecision. The smart choice was to leave. The safe choice was to walk away and search for human survivors. Nobody would blame him for abandoning a Velkorian cub. In fact, most people would think he was crazy for even considering helping it. The cub saw him and went completely still. Its multiple eyes locked onto Taemin. The creature released a smell that made his eyes water and his nose burn. Fear pheromones, he realized. The cub thought Taemin was going to kill it. It thrashed harder, trying desperately to free itself, but the effort only made it bleed more. It cried out again, a sound so full of terror and pain that Taemin felt something break inside his chest. He took a slow step forward. The cub hissed, showing all its teeth. Its claws extended fully, scraping against the metal. Taemin raised his hands slowly, palms out, trying to show he meant no harm. The cub did not understand the gesture. It snapped at the air, warning him to stay back. Tae-min stopped moving forward. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He sat down on the ground, about 2 meters away from the trapped cub. He did not try to touch it. He did not speak or make any sudden movements. He just sat there, keeping his hands visible and his body relaxed. The cub watched him with all 6 eyes. It continued to tremble, its whole body shaking with fear and pain. Minutes passed. Tae-min remained still, his breathing slow and steady. He had once read that many predator species could sense fear through rapid heartbeat and breathing. He focused on staying calm, even though his own heart wanted to race, slowly, very slowly. The cub's thrashing began to decrease. It still watched Tae-min closely, but it was no longer trying to attack or escape quite so desperately. Its breathing remained fast, but some of the panic seemed to fade from its eyes. Tae-min started to hum. It was an old song his mother used to sing when he was young and could not sleep. The melody was simple and gentle. He did not know if the cub could even hear sounds the way humans did, but it seemed to help. The creature's trembling lessened bit by bit. More time passed. The fires around them began to die down. The smoke thinned slightly. Tae-min kept humming, kept sitting still. His legs started to cramp from staying in one position, but he did not move. The cub needed to see that he was not a threat. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Tae-min began to move. He shifted his weight very slowly, making sure every motion was visible and predictable. The cub tensed but did not hiss. Tae-min stretched out one hand, moving it forward at a crawling pace. The cub watched the hand approach, its eyes tracking every centimeter of movement. When Tae-min's hand was close enough, he stopped. He let it rest there, palm down, fingers relaxed. The cub sniffed toward it, its small nostrils flaring. Then, in a gesture that made Tae-min's heart nearly stop, the cub slowly lowered its head and pressed its snout against his palm. The touch lasted only a second before the cub pulled back, but it was enough. Trust, even the smallest amount, had been established. Tae-min moved carefully to the metal beam, trapping the cub's leg. He examined it, trying to figure out how to lift it without causing more injury. The beam was heavy, but he found a piece of broken pipe he could use as a lever. He worked slowly, talking softly to the cub the entire time. When he finally lifted the beam enough for the leg to slide free, the cub whimpered but did not try to bite him. Tae-min tore strips from his uniform and wrapped them around the wounded leg as gently as he could. The cub flinched at the touch but allowed him to work. When he finished, the cub tried to stand but collapsed immediately. It was too weak from blood loss and pain. Tae-min made a decision that would change everything. He carefully scooped the cub into his arms. It was heavier than it looked, and its scales felt strange against his skin, somewhere between rough stone and smooth glass. The cub did not fight him. It pressed against his chest, trembling one last time before the shaking finally stopped. Tae-min carried it away from the burning wreckage, into the alien jungle, with no idea what would happen next. The jungle was trying to kill them. Tae-min learned this fact within the first hour of leaving the crash site. The purple vines he had seen hanging from the trees released a sticky sap that burned skin on contact. The ground was covered in moss that released spores when stepped on, making breathing difficult. Strange insects the size of his fist flew in swarms, attracted to the smell of blood from both him and the cub. He found shelter in a small cave halfway up a rocky hillside. It was barely large enough for both of them, but it was dry and seemed free of the aggressive plant life. Tae-min laid the cub down carefully on the flattest part of the cave floor. The creature's eyes were half closed, its breathing shallow. The makeshift bandages on its leg were already soaked through with purple blood. Tae-min knew he needed to find clean water and food. But he was afraid to leave the cub alone. What if it woke up and panicked? What if something else found it while he was gone? He sat at the cave entrance, watching the alien jungle grow darker as this world's sun began to set. The sky turned strange shades of orange and green. 3 moons appeared in the evening sky, each a different size. Behind him, the cub made a small sound in its sleep. A whimper of pain. Taemin looked back at it and felt his chest tighten. He had saved this creature. But for what? So it could die slowly in a cave instead of quickly under the wreckage. He had no medical supplies. No food. No way to contact anyone who might help. He was just a human engineer who had made a stupid choice to care about something that would probably kill him the moment it got strong enough. But he could not leave it. Not now. The next morning arrived with strange bird calls echoing through the jungle. Taemin's stomach cramped with hunger. He had not eaten since before the crash, almost a full day ago. The cub was still unconscious but breathing steadily. Taemin decided to search for water and food, staying close enough to keep the cave in sight. He found a small stream about 50 meters from the shelter. The water looked clear, but he had no way to know if it was safe for humans to drink. He took a small sip and waited, ready to feel sick. Nothing happened. The water tasted strange, slightly metallic, but it did not make him ill. He filled his empty canteen and brought it back to the cave. The cub had woken up while he was gone. It was pressed against the back wall of the cave, all 6 eyes watching him with suspicion. It hissed when he approached, though the sound was weak. Taemin sat down at the entrance again, giving it space. He drank some water from the canteen, then slowly placed it on the ground between them and pushed it toward the cub. The creature watched the canteen for a long time, before curiosity won over fear. It limped forward, dragging its injured leg, and sniffed at the strange object. Taemin showed it how to drink by tilting the canteen. The cub understood quickly. It drank desperately, water spilling from its mouth. When it finished, it looked at Taemin with what might have been gratitude in its alien eyes. Food was harder. Taemin knew Velkorians were carnivores. The cub needed meat, and he needed to hunt to get it. The problem was that Taemin had never hunted anything in his life. He was an engineer who spent his days fixing machines, not chasing animals through dangerous jungles, but he had no choice. He spent hours watching the jungle, learning its patterns. He noticed small creatures that looked like rats, with too many legs moving through the undergrowth. They traveled in pairs and seemed less dangerous than the other wildlife. Using a sharp piece of metal from the crash site that he had brought with him, Taemin waited near their trails. His first attempts were failures. The creatures were fast and could sense him coming. But hunger made him persistent. On his 7th try, he managed to corner one against a fallen log and struck it with the metal piece. The creature died quickly. Taemin felt sick looking at what he had done, but he carried the body back to the cave. The cub's reaction to the fresh meat was immediate. Its eyes brightened, and it made a clicking sound Taemin had not heard before. He placed the dead creature near the cub and stepped back. The young Velkorian ate quickly, tearing into the meat with its sharp teeth. When it finished, it looked at Taemin and made that clicking sound again. This time, Taemin understood. It was saying thank you. Days turned into a week. Then, 2 weeks. Taemin's hands became rough from handling sharp rocks and metal. His clothes were torn and stained. He learned which plants were safe to touch and which ones would burn his skin. He became better at hunting the rat-like creatures. Sometimes, he caught 2 or 3 in a day. The cub's leg slowly healed. It started moving around the cave more, testing its weight on the injured limb. Taemin changed the bandages regularly, using clean strips torn from the parts of his uniform he did not need. The cub no longer hissed when he approached. Instead, it would watch him with curious eyes, sometimes tilting its head in a gesture that seemed almost friendly. One day, while Taemin was cleaning the cub's wound, sunlight streaming through the cave entrance caught the creature's scales at just the right angle. They shimmered with brilliant gold and silver colors, like light reflecting off water. The sight was so beautiful that Tae-min stopped breathing for a moment. Sol, he said quietly. The word for sun in his language. It seemed like a good name for something that shined so brightly. The cub looked at him when he spoke. From that moment on, whenever Tae-min said Sol, the creature's ears would perk up. It had learned its name. Sol began to help with survival in unexpected ways. The cub's senses were far sharper than Tae-min's. It could detect dangerous animals before they got close, making a specific low growl that warned Tae-min to hide. It could smell water sources from far away. Once, when Tae-min was about to eat a plant he thought was safe, Sol knocked it from his hand and made distressed noises. Tae-min later saw one of the rat creatures eat the same plant and die within minutes. The jungle tested them constantly. Toxic rain fell every few days, forcing them to stay deep in the cave until it passed. The rain left burns on any exposed skin. Large predators prowled near their shelter at night, drawn by the smell of their food. Tae-min learned to hide their waste far from the cave and to cover the entrance with branches. Through it all, Sol and Tae-min grew closer. The cub began to follow him when he went hunting, limping along behind. It could not help catch prey yet, but it seemed to want to stay near him. At night, when the temperature dropped and strange sounds filled the darkness, Sol would press against Tae-min's side for warmth. The first time this happened, Tae-min froze in fear. He knew that one wrong move could trigger the cub's hunting instincts. Valkorians, killed by reflex, but Sol simply rested its head against his leg and closed all 6 of its eyes. The cub trusted him completely. Tae-min carefully placed his hand on Sol's back, feeling the smooth scales warm beneath his palm. The cub made a soft rumbling sound, almost like a cat's purr but deeper. Tae-min felt something inside him shift. This was no longer just about survival. This was no longer just about helping an injured animal until rescue came. This was family. 3 weeks after the crash, Tae-min woke to find Sol standing at the cave entrance, staring at the sky. The cub's body was tense, all its attention focused upward. Tae-min joined it and saw what had caught Sol's attention. High above the jungle, moving through the clouds, was a ship. Not a small ship. A warship. Massive and dark against the alien sky. The ship bore markings Tae-min recognized from the galactic databases he had studied. Valkorian military. They had come looking for survivors. They had come looking for their cub. Tae-min felt his blood run cold. He knew what would happen when adult Valkorians found him with one of their young. They would assume he had kidnapped it. They would assume he had hurt it. They would not listen to explanations. They would simply kill him and take Sol. Sol looked up at Tae-min, then back at the sky. The cub made a questioning sound, as if asking what they should do. Tae-min had no answer. They could run deeper into the jungle, but they would be found eventually. They could try to hide, but Valkorian tracking technology was among the best in the galaxy. The ship began to descend, heading directly toward their location. Tae-min realized with growing horror that Sol must have a tracking implant. Of course, the cub would be chipped. Any species that valued their young would do the same. The Valkorians had probably been searching for days, and now they had found what they were looking for. Tae-min looked down at Sol. The cub looked back at him with complete trust in its multiple eyes. Whatever happened next, Tae-min decided, he would not run. He would not abandon Sol. They had survived together. They would face whatever came next together. He sat down at the cave entrance and waited. Sol sat beside him, pressing against his leg. The trembling that had defined their first meeting was gone completely. Now there was only trust. Only bond. Only the impossible friendship between a human and a creature that should have been his enemy. The warship landed in the jungle clearing below. The Valkorians emerged from their warship like living nightmares. They were massive, each one standing at least 3 meters tall. Their scales were darker than Sol's, hardened into natural armor plates that looked like they could stop bullets. Scars marked their bodies. proof of countless battles. They moved with the confidence of apex predators who had never known fear. There were 5 of them in the landing party. They wore minimal clothing, just utility harnesses that held weapons and tools. Their claws, each as long as Tae-min's fingers, gleamed in the sunlight. They communicated with each other in a series of clicks, growls, and hisses that sounded like rocks grinding together. Tae-min could see them from the cave entrance. They were searching the area systematically, following some kind of tracking signal. Saul stood beside him, making a low, humming sound. The cub was excited to see its own kind, but it did not leave Tae-min's side. The lead Velkorian was female, larger than the others and carrying herself with obvious authority. Her scales were almost black, with streaks of deep red running along her spine. She wore more decorations than the others, pieces of metal woven into a pattern on her harness. A leader, Tae-min realized, possibly a commander or something similar. She stopped suddenly, her head turning directly toward the cave. She had detected them. She made a sharp clicking sound, and all 5 Velkorians began moving up the hillside with frightening speed. They climbed the rocks like they were flat ground, their claws finding grip where Tae-min would have struggled. Tae-min's hands shook. This was it. He was going to die. Every logical part of his brain screamed at him to run, to hide deeper in the cave, to do anything except stand here waiting for death. But he had promised himself he would not leave Saul. The leader reached the cave first. She stood at the entrance, filling the space with her massive body. Her multiple eyes locked onto Tae-min. She opened her mouth, showing teeth that could easily tear him apart. She made a sound, a deep growl, that vibrated in Tae-min's chest. Tae-min stood his ground. His legs felt weak, and his heart hammered so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. But he did not move. He kept his hands visible and his stance non-threatening, just as he had with Sol. The leader's eyes shifted to Sol. She saw the cub standing next to the human, saw the bandages on its leg, saw how close they were to each other. Her growl deepened, becoming a sound of pure rage. She took a step forward. Sol moved between them. The cub placed itself directly in front of Tae-min, facing the adult Velkorian. Sol made a series of rapid clicks and chirps, sounds more complex than anything Tae-min had heard before. The cub was speaking, really speaking, in its own language. The leader froze. Her eyes widened in what looked like shock. The other 4 Velkorians had reached the cave now, and they too stopped moving. They stared at Sol with expressions Tae-min could not read. Sol continued making sounds, its whole body involved in the communication. It gestured with its head toward its injured leg, then toward Tae-min, then back to the wreckage visible in the distance. The cub was telling a story. It was explaining what had happened. The leader listened, completely still. When Sol finished, silence filled the cave. Tae-min held his breath. He had no idea what Sol had said, but the adult Velkorians looked confused. One of them made a questioning sound. The leader responded with a short series of clicks. Then she did something that made Tae-min's mind struggle to understand. She lowered herself closer to the ground, bringing her head level with Sol. She sniffed the air around the cub, taking in scents. Her eyes moved to Tae-min's torn uniform, to the strips of fabric that served as bandages, to the crude shelter and the remains of hunted animals near the cave entrance. She was reading evidence. She was investigating the scene like a detective, and what she found seemed to contradict everything she expected. The leader stood back up to her full height. She looked at Tae-min again, and this time there was something different in her gaze. Not friendship, not exactly, but perhaps uncertainty. She spoke, and her voice was like gravel rolling down a mountain. The words were not in any human language, but there was a device on her harness. It clicked and hummed, then produced words Tae-min could understand. A translator. "You are human?" The words came out flat and mechanical from the device. But the question was clear. Yes, Taemin managed to say, his voice cracked from days of barely speaking. Why did you not flee? The leader asked. And Taemin understood this was the most important question. Everything depended on his answer. He could have given many answers. He could have talked about duty or morality. He could have mentioned hoping for reward or rescue. But Taemin was too tired for complicated explanations. He told the simple truth. It was scared. The leader's head tilted slightly. She looked at Saul again, then back at Taemin. She made a sound. Something between a growl and a sigh. Then she spoke again. Her words coming out slowly as if she was thinking carefully about each one. Prey runs from predators. This is natural law. You are prey. My young is predator. I know, Taemin said, but you sat beside it. You waited. You fed it. You protected it. The leader seemed to be working through a puzzle she could not solve. This is not prey behavior. I am not prey, Taemin said quietly. I am just someone who did not want to watch something die when I could help. The leader made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it sounded more like rocks breaking. She turned to the other Velkorians and spoke in their language. They responded with what seemed like argument. Sharp sounds went back and forth. One of them, a male with green-tinted scales, appeared angry. He gestured at Taemin aggressively. Saul made distressed noises and moved closer to Taemin. The cub was protecting him again. This seemed to surprise the angry male. He stopped mid-gesture, staring at Saul. The leader made a final sound that was clearly a command. The other Velkorians went quiet immediately. She approached Taemin slowly. Ever, he forced himself to stay still even as this massive predator came within arm's reach. She leaned down, bringing her face close to his. Her breath was hot and smelled like metal. She sniffed him the same way she had sniffed the cave. Taemin understood she was reading chemical signals his body produced. Fear, exhaustion, stress, but also something else. Care, affection. The bond he had formed with Saul left traces in his scent, invisible to humans but obvious to Velkorian senses. The leader pulled back. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. There was still no warmth in it, but the hostility had decreased. I am War Matron Nalrix. I command this search vessel. This cub is blood of my blood, daughter of my sister who died in the crash. She paused, and for a moment Taemin saw something that might have been grief in her alien eyes. You saved her when I could not. Doesn't it? Taemin did not know what to say to that. Nalrix continued speaking. My kind has strict laws. We do not accept help from weaker species. We do not show gratitude to prey. We do not acknowledge debts to those we should hunt. She looked at Saul, and her expression softened in a way that made her seem almost human. But you did something my own warriors would not have done. You sat beside terror and did not run. You chose patience when survival said to flee. O teen. She turned back to Taemin. This changes nothing between our peoples. Humans are still young, still weak, still not Velkorian, she said the last part like it explained everything. Nalrix made a gesture to the other Velkorians. They moved into the cave, gathering Sol's few belongings. One of them had medical equipment. He examined Sol's leg with professional efficiency, making approving sounds at Taemin's bandaging work. Come, Nalrix said to Taemin. We will take you to our ship. There are other survivors from the crash in our medical bay. You will be returned to your people. Taemin looked at Sol. The cub looked back at him with all 6 eyes. He realized this was goodbye. He had known it would come, but the pain of it hit him harder than he expected. Saul made a sad sound, pressing against his leg one more time. Can I say goodbye? Taemin asked. Nalrix nodded slowly. Taemin knelt down, bringing himself to Sol's level. He placed his hand on the cub's head, feeling the warm scales beneath his palm. Sol nuzzled against his hand, making that purring sound. You are going to be okay. Taemin whispered. You will grow up strong. You will have family who loves you. Saul made a questioning click. The cub did not want to leave him. Taemin felt tears sting his eyes, but he blinked them back. I will miss you too, he said. Nalrix watched this exchange with an expression that was impossible to read. When Taemin finally stood up, she spoke again. The cub wishes to stay with you. This is unusual. Valkorian young do not bond with other species. They bond only with pack. She paused. But she sees you as pack now. What does that mean? Taemin asked. It means, Nalrix said slowly, that perhaps the universe is stranger than we thought. The Galactic Council chamber was enormous. The ceiling stretched so high above that Taemin could barely see it. Representatives from dozens of species sat in curved rows, each in their designated section. The architecture was designed to impress, to remind everyone who entered that they were now part of something bigger than their own world. Taemin stood in the center of the chamber floor, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. He wore formal clothing that the human diplomatic team had given him. The suit felt strange after weeks of wearing torn and stained work clothes. His hands would not stop shaking, so he kept them clasped behind his back where no one could see. Beside him stood Nalrix. The war matron looked completely at ease, as if standing before the most powerful governing body in the galaxy was just another day for her. She probably felt that way. Valkorians did not fear much. At Taemin's feet sat Sol. The cub had grown noticeably in the month since the rescue. Its scales shined brighter, and its injured leg had healed completely. But Sol still refused to leave Taemin's side. When they tried to separate them on the ship, Sol had become so distressed that Nalrix ordered them to stay together. It was easier than dealing with a hysterical Valkorian cub. The council speaker, a tall being from a species called the Methodian, called the session to order. Its voice echoed through the chamber with unnatural clarity. We gather today to address an unusual incident that has drawn galactic attention. A human, Taemin, survivor of the freighter Distant Hope, rendered aid to a Valkorian cub following the vessel's crash on Verath 7. This action has raised questions about humanity's place in galactic society and the nature of interspecies relations. Murmurs spread through the assembled representatives. Taemin could feel hundreds of eyes on him. Most of those eyes did not look friendly. A representative from the Methodian delegation stood. This incident, while touching, hardly seems worthy of council attention. The human acted on instinct. Nothing more. Instinct would have been to flee, countered a voice from the Valkorian section. It was Nalrix who spoke. No prey species has instincts that tell them to sit beside a wounded predator and wait for trust. This was choice, not instinct. Choice born from ignorance, perhaps, said another representative. This one from the Velkoth Empire. The Velkoth were a rival species to the Valkorians, snake-like beings with cold intelligence in their eyes. Humans are new to space. They do not yet understand the dangers. This one simply did not know better. Taemin felt anger rise in his chest, but he stayed quiet. He had been told to let others speak for him. The human diplomatic team had made that very clear. The Velkoth representative continued. Furthermore, this incident should not be used to advance humanity's status in the Council. They remain a young species. Inexperienced. Weak. The word, weak, seemed to carry special meaning. Several other representatives nodded in agreement. A human diplomat stood from the Earth delegation section. Her name was Daun, and she had been assigned as humanity's chief representative. Weakness is a matter of perspective. What some call weak, others might call gentle. What some call inexperienced, others might call open-minded. Pretty words, the Velkoth said dismissively. But the galaxy runs on strength, not gentleness. Humanity's compassion will be their downfall when they face real threats. Real threats like a wounded cub? Nalrix's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. She stepped forward, her massive form commanding attention. Let me tell you what I saw on Varath 7. I saw a human who had every reason to abandon my sister's child. I saw evidence of weeks spent hunting, protecting, healing. I saw bond marks in chemical traces that do not lie. This human chose to face death, rather than leave a creature that could have killed him at any moment. She turned to face the assembled council. My species has built an empire on strength. We are warriors. We do not know defeat. But I tell you now, we would not have done what this human did. We would have weighed the risk and made the logical choice. We would have survived. Yes. But we would have lost something. In that survival, the chamber fell silent. Velkorians admitting that another species did something they could not was unheard of. The other representatives looked stunned. The Velkoth representative recovered first. You praise weakness. Then, you say that illogical emotion is somehow superior to practical survival. I say, Nalrix responded coldly, that we have defined strength too narrowly. Strength is not just claws and weapons. It is also the strength to choose compassion when every instinct screams for self-preservation. It is the strength to sit beside terror and wait, with patience, for understanding to grow. Sol made a sound at Taemin's feet. The cub looked up at him with complete trust in its eyes. The simple gesture seemed to carry more weight than any speech. Daun spoke again. Humanity does not claim to be stronger than the established powers. We know we are young. We know we have much to learn. But perhaps we can offer something that has been lost as civilizations grew older and harder. Perhaps we remember how to build bridges where others see only barriers. Bridges can be burned, the Velkoth said. Yes, Daun agreed. But walls can be climbed. No defense is perfect. The question is whether we want a galaxy of walls or a galaxy of bridges. The debate continued for hours. Representatives argued about humanity's character, about whether one incident meant anything, about the political implications of granting humans more recognition. Taemin stood through all of it, his feet aching, his back sore. Sol eventually lay down at his feet, resting but alert. During a break in the proceedings, Nalrix approached Taemin. You are quiet, she observed. They told me not to speak, Taemin said. Rules made by those who fear what you might say. Nalrix made a sound like stones grinding. If they ask you direct questions, you should answer. Honestly. Let them see what I saw. When the council reconvened, the speaker addressed Taemin directly. You have heard much said about your actions. Much analysis of your choices. The council would hear from you directly. Why did you save the Velkorian cub? Taemin looked up at the hundreds of beings watching him. He thought about all the political implications, all the careful words he could use. Then he thought about that first day in the wreckage, about the scared cub trapped and bleeding, about the simple choice he had made. Because leaving it felt wrong, he said simply, I am not a soldier or a hero. I am just an engineer. I fix broken things. The cub was broken, hurt, and scared. I had the ability to help, so I did. That is all. You risked your life for a creature that could have killed you, the speaker said. This seems illogical. Maybe, Taemin agreed. But logic is not the same as right. Logic would have left that cub to die. Logic would have meant one less person in the universe who might have become a friend. I chose possibility over logic. The Velkoth representative hissed. Friendship between humans and Velkorians? Impossible. Your species are too different. Sol stood up. The cub walked to Taemin's side and pressed against his leg. Taemin reached down and rested his hand on Sol's head. The gesture was so natural, so full of obvious affection, that it silenced the entire chamber. Impossible? Taemin asked quietly. Then what is this? A new voice spoke. One that had been silent until now. It came from the scientific delegation, a species called the Archivists, who prided themselves on knowledge. From a biological standpoint, what we witness here is remarkable. Valkorian young imprint strongly on protective figures, but never on other species. The chemical markers of bonding are unmistakable. This human and this cub have formed a pack bond that crosses every biological barrier. We have no records of this occurring before, which proves it is unnatural, the Velkoth said. Which proves, the archivist countered, that nature is more flexible than we assumed. If this bond is possible, what else might be possible? What other barriers might be illusions we have built in our minds? The debate shifted. Scientists began discussing implications. Political representatives argued about precedent. Through it all, Taemin stood with Sol at his side, a living example of something that should not exist but undeniably did. Finally, the council speaker called for order. We will vote on whether to establish formal diplomatic relations with Earth, recognizing humanity's unique potential for interspecies cooperation. The vote was close. Many species remained skeptical, but enough were curious. Enough were intrigued by the possibility of something new, that the measure passed. Humanity would have a full seat on the council. They would be recognized as equals, not as children. After the session ended, Nalrix approached Taemin once more. You have changed things, she said. Not just for your people. For all of us. You have made the galaxy question its assumptions. I just helped a scared cub, Taemin said. Yes, Nalrix agreed. And in doing so, you reminded us what we had forgotten. That strength without compassion is just violence. That logic without heart is just cold calculation. That the universe is better when we choose to sit beside fear rather than run from it. She placed one massive clawed hand on his shoulder, gentle despite its size. You will be remembered, human. Long after both of us are gone, beings will tell the story of the man who sat beside terror and waited for trust. Taemin looked down at Sol, who looked back at him with complete love in all 6 eyes. I hope they get the story right, he said. I hope they remember that it was not about being brave. It was about choosing to care when caring seemed impossible. That, Nalrix said softly, is what bravery actually is. 3 years had passed since the crash on Vareth 7. Taemin barely recognized himself when he looked in mirrors now. His hands, once soft from working with clean machinery, were marked with scars from jungle survival and rough work. His face had changed too, becoming older in a way that had nothing to do with time. He had seen things most humans never would. He had lived through experiences that changed how he understood the universe. But the biggest change was not physical. It was the fact that he now served as Earth's primary liaison to the Valkorian clans, a job that should not exist, a position that made no logical sense. Yet, here he was, living on a space station that orbited between human and Valkorian space, building bridges between 2 species that had nothing in common except a shared story about a scared cub and a patient human. Sol was always with him. The cub had grown into an adolescent now, standing as tall as Taemin's shoulder when on all 4 legs. Its scales had darkened slightly with age, taking on deeper shades of blue and purple. The injured leg had healed completely, leaving only a small scar that Sol wore, with what seemed like pride. When other young Valkorians asked about it, Sol would tell them the story. Every time, the story ended the same way, with Sol clicking out the words, "My human," when referring to Taemin. The station, called New Horizon, had become something special. Humans had built it with help from a dozen other species. It was designed as a neutral meeting place, somewhere different cultures could interact peacefully. But it had become much more than that. In one section of the station, a human woman named Daun ran what she called the Interspecies Rehabilitation Center. Taemin visited often, amazed at what he saw each time. Injured alien creatures were cared for using techniques adapted from how humans treated Earth animals. Patience, gentle handling, positive reinforcement. Ideas that seemed obvious to humans, but were revolutionary to species that had always used force and dominance. Daun had taken Tayman's experience with Sol and expanded it into an entire philosophy. She worked with beings from a dozen worlds, showing them that hurt things needed care, not control. That fear could be soothed with patience instead of punished with violence. You started something important, she told Tayman during one visit. She was bottle-feeding a small creature from a methane-breathing species, moving slowly to avoid startling it. Before you and Sol, most species kept strict barriers between themselves and others. Now look, she gestured around the center. Tayman looked. He saw a Velkorian adolescent carefully wrapping bandages on a wounded creature from a species their kind had once hunted. He saw a Methodian, usually cold and logical, speaking softly to calm a frightened animal. He saw species that had been enemies for generations, working side by side to help beings that could not help themselves. It is strange, Tayman admitted. I just did not want to leave something to die alone. That is what makes it powerful. Daun said. You did not do it for politics or recognition. You did it because your heart would not let you walk away. That honesty is what changed minds. People can tell when compassion is real. In another part of the station, a former human soldier named Hyun Woo taught classes on what he called understanding without words. He had been injured in a small conflict on a border world and lost the use of his legs. Instead of giving up, he had discovered a talent for reading body language and emotional cues across species barriers. His classes were always full. Beings from species that barely spoke to each other learned to communicate through gesture, through patience, through attention to subtle cues. Hyunwoo used examples from human interaction with animals, showing how ancient techniques for calming horses or reading dog emotions could apply to alien species too. Humans spent thousands of years learning to understand creatures completely different from us, Hyunwoo explained to his current class, which included 2 Velkorians, 3 Velkoth, and 4 beings from species Taymin did not recognize. We learned that fear looks similar across species. That pain has universal tells. That trust must be earned the same way, whether you are dealing with a nervous dog or a wounded predator. One of the Velkoth students hissed skeptically. These are animal training techniques. We are not animals. No, Hyunwoo agreed calmly. But we all feel fear. We all feel pain. We all need to trust before we can cooperate. Those things cross every barrier. The techniques work because they address universal needs, not because they treat anyone as lesser. The Velkoth considered this and said nothing more. But Tayman noticed the being stayed after class to ask more questions. The impact of what had happened on Vareth 7 spread in unexpected ways. Crime rates dropped on stations where humans served as mediators. Something about human patience and willingness to listen made others more willing to compromise. Trade agreements that had been stuck for years suddenly moved forward when human negotiators facilitated discussions, not because humans were smarter or stronger, but because they approached problems differently. They asked questions like, "What are you afraid of?" instead of, "What do you want?" They looked for emotional barriers instead of just logical disagreements. They treated every being, regardless of species or status, with basic respect. Other species noticed. Some mocked it as weakness. Others saw it as a tool they could use. But a growing number began to wonder if humans were onto something important. Something that had been lost as civilizations became more advanced and focused on power. Tayman's work took him many places. He traveled to Velkorian worlds where he was greeted with suspicion that slowly turned to curiosity. He visited human colonies where people wanted to hear his story firsthand. He spoke at universities and military academies, always telling the same truth: that he had just been scared and tired and faced with a choice to care or not care. People want to make it more complicated, he told Sol one evening as they sat in their quarters watching the stars through the viewport. They want it to be about strategy or politics or some grand plan. But it was just about you being hurt, and me being unable to walk away from that. Saul made a rumbling sound that Taemin had learned meant contentment. The Valkorian rested its head on his lap, something that still amazed anyone who witnessed it. Valkorians did not show affection openly. They certainly did not show it to other species. But Saul had never learned those rules. Or maybe Saul had learned different rules. Rules written in a cold cave, while a human hummed lullabies and wrapped wounds with strips from his own uniform. 6 months after the council vote, Taemin received an unusual request. The Varath 7 planet, where the crash had happened, had been approved for scientific study. Researchers wanted to understand why the planet was so hostile to most life, but seemed to react differently to human presence. They wanted Taemin to lead the expedition. He accepted. Returning to Varath 7 felt like closing a circle. When the research ship landed in the same jungle where he had struggled to survive, Taemin felt memories wash over him. But everything looked different now. The purple vines that had burned his skin before seemed less aggressive. The toxic moss released fewer spores. The predatory insects kept their distance. The scientists were fascinated. They ran tests and collected samples, trying to understand the change. The best theory they developed was that human pheromones, the chemical signals of stress and fear and determination that Taemin had released during his time here, had somehow affected the planet's ecosystem. The plants and animals had adapted, becoming less hostile to similar signals. It is like the planet learned humans were not threats, one researcher explained. Your presence here, your survival, your care for Saul, it all left chemical traces. The environment responded. They built a research station at the crash site. A memorial was erected for those who had died aboard the distant Hope. Names were carved into stone, both human and alien names, all equal in death as they should have been in life. One day, while Taemin was inspecting the memorial, he heard a sound, a familiar high-pitched keening. His heart stopped. He turned to see a young Valkorian cub, separated from its research group, backed against a tree by one of the jungle predators. The cub was terrified, crying out in fear. The predator was something Taemin had never seen before, large and covered in black scales. It growled, preparing to attack. Taemin started forward, unsure what he could do but unable to stand by. Then he saw movement from another direction. A human child, maybe 8 years old, daughter of one of the researchers. Her name was Bora. She had been exploring near her parents and heard the cub's cries. Taemin expected her to run for help. Instead, Bora did something that made him stop breathing. She slowly sat down on the ground, several meters from both the predator and the cub. She did not make sudden movements. She did not shout or wave her arms. She just sat, her small body relaxed, her breathing steady. The predator turned toward her, confused by this new presence. Bora did not flinch. She sat very still, the way children do when they are trying hard to be patient. The predator sniffed the air, reading her scent. It found no aggression there, no challenge, just calm presence. The predator lost interest and wandered away into the jungle. The Valkorian cub remained pressed against the tree, still scared but no longer in immediate danger. Bora continued sitting, not approaching, not speaking, just being there. A calm presence in a frightening moment. Slowly, so slowly, the cub's trembling began to ease. Its breathing calmed. It looked at the small human child with curious eyes. Bora smiled gently and stayed where she was. Taemin felt tears on his face before he realized he was crying. Saul appeared beside him, drawn by his emotional response. Together, they watched as history repeated itself in a new generation. A human child and a frightened cub, finding connection across impossible barriers. When Bora's parents arrived, frantic with worry, they found their daughter sitting peacefully near a Valkorian cub that should have been dangerous. They started to scold her, but Taemin stopped them. She did exactly right, he said softly. She is learning what humans do best. She is learning how to sit beside fear and wait for it to become trust. That evening, Taemin sat with Sol watching the sunset paint the alien sky in shades of orange and green. The research station hummed with activity around them. Scientists from a dozen species worked together, studying, learning, building understanding, one discovery at a time. "This is what we started," Taemin said to Sol. "Not just you and me, but the idea that different can still mean family, that scary can still mean friend, that the universe is better when we choose to care instead of choosing to fear." Sol made a sound of agreement, pressing closer against Taemin's side. In the distance, Taemin could see Bora playing with the Velkorian cub under careful supervision. The cub followed her around like Sol had once followed him, learning that humans were safe, that gentleness was not weakness, that trust was possible. Taemin thought about the galaxy as it existed now compared to 3 years ago. Humans had earned their place, not through weapons or wealth or ancient knowledge. They had earned it by remembering something simple and powerful: that every being, no matter how different or frightening, was deserving of compassion. That patience could achieve what force never would. That sitting beside terror and waiting, just waiting with an open heart, could change the universe. He looked at Sol, his impossible friend, his family member from a species that should have been his enemy. He thought about Daeun's rehabilitation center, about Hyunwoo's classes, about all the small moments of connection happening across the galaxy, because people had seen that change was possible. This was humanity's gift to the stars. Not the ability to fight or conquer, not even the ability to understand. Just the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to care when caring seemed impossible. Of seeing fear and responding not with more fear, but with patience. Of sitting beside the trembling and waiting, always waiting, until the trembling finally stopped. And in that moment, as 3 moons rose above an alien jungle, and a human sat beside a young Velkorian who trusted him completely, Taemin understood that the story was not ending. It was just beginning. Every human child who learned to show compassion to alien beings, every species that chose understanding over suspicion, every act of gentleness in a harsh universe, these were all continuations of that first choice he had made in the wreckage. The choice to care, the choice to stay, the choice to believe that trust was possible, even when every logical reason said otherwise. That choice echoed across the stars now, growing louder with each passing day, teaching the galaxy something it had forgotten in its rush toward progress and power. That strength was meaningless without kindness, that survival was empty without connection, and that the bravest thing any being could do was sit beside fear and wait for it to become love.